Hello again, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here. And today we're going to continue the series on focal points. Previous videos we studied what happens when we focus our attack on the G7 square, which is located directly in front of the king in the castled position. And of course, the G2 square if it's black attacking or counterattacking the white pieces. We also looked at the H7 square, which is really popular with the classic bishop sacrifice or Greco's gift. We looked at F7 and the deadly nature of it in the openings and the middle games because it's the weakest pawn on the board from the beginning. But what happens when black or white, I suppose, moves their G-pawn forward and giving us this fianchettoed pawn structure where we'd want to place our bishop inside there, patrolling the long diagonal and covering the infiltration squares. Well, what happens is this forward pawn that's been moved, you can kind of think of it as the head of a pawn chain, is just begging to be attacked. And so here's a basic diagram that I set up, just showing you some ideas that the H-pawn could march forward, especially if there's a rook that hasn't castled yet. I believe they refer to this as the can opener because it intends on attacking, and after the H-pawns are off the board, what that does is it opens up the H-file for attack by the rook, and that's a common theme in these fianchettoed positions. Also, the light-squared bishop for white and the queen are only one move away from their starting positions to be able to be lined up and attack. And of course, we saw that when we looked at attacking the H7 square focal point video, but here we're looking at them attacking here, and the idea is that this bishop would sacrifice itself, followed up by the queen coming in afterwards, and decimating all of these pawns, with the pawns gone, exposing the king, and leaving a queen staring at him right here on G6. So something like this, if we just follow it through, pawn takes, opening up that H file with the can opener, bishop sacrifice, and that's a checkmate in this diagram. It might not be that easy in a normal game. If we back that diagram up, something I did add on to here, what I wanted to show you was how this pawn on E5 gets rid of this knight, forcing it away. And that's a common theme in a lot of attacking prospects for white, is pushing their E4 pawn into E5 so that this knight has to leave. And so we might see that a lot as well. Well, let's just move along really quickly here. We've got, let's go from black's perspective. What about attacking the pawn on G3? So this was a game by Lasker and Zurich in 1934. Lasker with the white pieces, Zurich with the black pieces. And what we see here is something that happens actually quite common is if the F pawn has moved, or if the H pawn is missing, then you only have one pawn supporting the G3 or G6 pawns. So of course we see the classic attack, which is the battery of the bishop and the queen, and the bishop's going to sacrifice itself. Now in the game with Lasker and Zurich, Lasker was aware of this attacking plan, and rather than taking back with the pawn on H, he simply moved his rook and tried to create a counterattack of his own. Hopefully you notice here that black is looking at a back rank checkmate situation, and if black does nothing, the threat here, of course, is checkmate. So trying to do a little something on his own. Well, the game continued. Bishop captures again. If you're going to give me your pawns, I'm going to take it with check. That's always good. So he had to move his king up into the corner, trying to keep it safe. And the game continues from here. And what we end up with is really an advantage for black. White's king is exposed. Black's king has some safety around it. Black has the two bishops, which are considered to be an advantage over the two knights. So all of these advantages with good play, black is going to win here. Of course, some of you might be saying, but Zach, look, checkmate is available. No, it's not available. All it is a check and a block. So, but if that bishop wasn't there, you'd have been right. It would have been a sneaky checkmate. Let's back it up for a moment, all the way to the beginning here. So what would happen if white were to accept the sacrifice, accept the sacrifice with the h-pawn. What this allows is for the queen to come in now and get an attack on the king. And from here, there's a few different variations. Some lead to an advantage of an exchange, maybe a piece. But this variation here leads to checkmate. We'll show you just one idea here. What if the king went into the corner, right? What would black do here? So we can capture with check. That's going to force the queen to not be doubled up with her rook anymore. And you'll notice it puts her into a pin. So now that rook is in a soft pin against the queen, allowing us to cause check. You see that soft pin. So certainly the rook does not want to capture, because then this queen is coming off the board and that's a losing position. So king has to move. And now hopefully you see that the bishop gives a discovered check, picking up yet another pawn. And obviously this rook cannot block simply because, well, checkmate is looming. All right, so has to step out of the way. And then from here, with this check, it's game over. It doesn't matter what white does. If white steps to the side, it's checkmate in the corner. If white instead decides to block that check, well, then it's checkmate again. So there's opportunities for checkmate in that position. So that was the idea of this. Just simply you take, and gosh, if they take back, you get 2 pawns for the piece and an attack. So that's kind of the idea there. So let's move along to a double attack on g6 here. Saunders versus Winter in 1934. We can see this pawn structure again. Already that h7 pawn is missing. So we only really have one supporter of the g6 pawn. And hopefully you already noticed that both of these rooks are staring at it, which means there's an opportunity for a sacrifice. So anytime there's an opportunity for a sacrifice on a focal point, you should take the time to look at it and see what you would do. Why don't you go ahead and do that for a moment. You've already got the idea that we're probably going to sacrifice a rook here, but which rook? Which rook would you sacrifice to get some movement, an opportunity on this g6 pawn? All right, for those of you who paused the video, welcome back. And what we have here in the game with Saunders versus Winter is that Saunders went ahead and captured with the rook on f, opening up this diagonal for the queen. And that was the purpose of maneuvering that rook instead of the other. If you take a back one move, you can see that the queen has no access in here to e7. And why does the queen want access? Because after this f pawn moves, well, now she can attack across, right? So after the rook and the sacrifice is accepted, you can see in comes the queen. And because there's no pawn here now, we have an attack. And it continued from here, blocking with the queen. Okay. A double sacrifice at g6. That's what makes this game fun to look at, especially when we're talking about focal points on g6. And the nice thing here is that the queen cannot take. She's pinned. So the king is going to have to take care of business. So that makes it easier to calculate, right? But then the problem is it leads into this fork. And it's a royal fork, and so no matter where the king goes, white's going to pick up this queen. We can make a nonsense move here for the king, wherever you think you might want to go. It doesn't really matter. Maybe off to the side or something. Well, gosh, that just leads to another fork, so that seems bad, right? Maybe here. Well, that leads to a really strong check. Well, see, that seems bad. Doesn't even matter what he does. Once that queen is off the table, it's just 2 rooks and a bishop versus the queen and the knight. But the biggest problem is, while white's king has some cover over here in the corner, black's king is exposed. All right, so moving right along. A classic example, if I can talk today, of the elementary bishop sacrifice on g6. This was Frank Marshall versus Byrne in 1900. I think they were in Paris at the time. And this game only lasted 18 moves. So let's just take a quick peek at it and what they did. Frank Marshall, of course, one of the most famous American players at the turn of the century. Queen's pawn opening. Okay. And Queen's Gambit declined. All of these are pretty well-known theoretical moves for the time, and most of them still exist for the day. And in this one, we've got the e3 move, castles. Okay, looks pretty standard. Going for a fianchetto on the queen side, just developing our pieces, exchanging in the center. So we have sort of an exchange variation here. But now the whole purpose of this bishop on g5 is because we want to get rid of this defensive knight. Getting rid of the knight on f6 really opens up some opportunities, primarily when we talked about the focal point on h7, because it's no longer as a knight protecting that square. Okay, so you can see now that there's an opportunity. Not as much of an opportunity on g7 because the bishop is defending. So you start to see what focal points you might want to be thinking about. Well, white hasn't castled yet. So attacking with the h-pawn seems like a wonderful idea. And now black does something interesting. Probably wanting to bring the bishop in and have a typical fianchettoed structure for a nice defense. The problem is he's walking right into the idea that we're going to move this can opener up and have an attack. And also, this bishop is already aiming at g6, and this queen is one move away from that opening diagram I had shown you. So we proceed with the can opener. After the rook makes some space, we open up the h-file, and now you can see the rook has access into the king's position. So already you're seeing an idea of how to defeat the fianchettoed position. So we bring our queen over, and now we've got that battery of the bishop and the queen targeting that g6 focal point. So black thinks he's safe. He's accomplished his goal. He's got his fianchettoed bishop with his pawns together, and it looks good until the sacrifice. And once he takes back, white has 2 pawns for the bishop. But more importantly, where did all those pawns go from the safety of being castled? They're gone. Even in that fianchettoed position, still gone. So black is exposed and in a lot of trouble. If white wants to, he still has the opportunity to castle over to the queen side and get safe very quickly. Okay? Well, black's pieces, all of these pieces, even the queen, are on the queen side of the board. They're nowhere near helping defend their king. But black is a little too late trying to get a knight over to help. Bringing our knight to g5, and you can already see we've got an attack from the rook. We've got an attack from the knight. And of course the queen here. They're all working together swimmingly. So black does what he can to try and bring more aid. And go ahead and pause the video here for a moment. What would you do to win the game? We'll give you a second to pause. Looking at all these attacking threats. And hopefully you found this move here. It's another sacrifice, but it's a decoy. A decoy is when you force a piece or lure a piece onto a square that it really doesn't want to be on. So we check the king. And what's the king to do here? This bishop is pinned by the queen, so it can't do anything. These squares are covered by the knight, and this rook is trying to say checkmate. The only thing he can do is capture it. That's the decoy. We've lured him over, and now it's checkmate. We have our queen on the critical square, supported by this knight. Okay, so that was Frank Marshall's attack against g6. Let's take a look at Matanovic and Keininger in 1955. This game didn't last too many moves. Looks about maybe 25 or so moves. We'll kind of go quickly through it. An e-pawn opening, okay, and attacking the center right away. And we're not going to worry too much about the opening theory here. We're just going to be getting the pieces where they need to go. And you can see already that this fianchettoed position has come in. So the first thing you should be thinking about is focal point on g6, what can I do with it? Okay, well already we've got a bishop here. We haven't castled yet, so maybe we can use a can opener. Let's make sure that he castles that direction first. So some basic moves. We get king safety, fianchettoed. Finally, the castling has happened. Okay. So we can see that they're doing things, you know, basic tactics like pins. All right. I don't know why he got rid of his defensive bishop, this monster bishop, for the knight over here. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'm sure some grandmaster will watch the video because, you know, hey, grandmasters watch my videos all the time, right? And in the comments will tell me why they did that. This has got to be a mistake here. You've created a dark color complex or a weak square complex in front of your king. White can now use these dark squares against you. You do not ever want to just get rid of your fianchettoed bishop unless there's a very good reason. It is a severe weakening. All right, so we've got a nice little X-ray attack on the queen. And look at that. White invades on the weak dark squares because that bishop is gone. All right. Trying to give some coverage from the queen. And there it is. There's our sacrifice. Again, winning 2 pawns for the piece. Now, some colors have popped up here, and what am I trying to show you? The king is in check. And someone might say, well, why not just block with the queen? Well, the why not is pretty simple, because the queen is the only thing protecting the bishop, and the bishop would fall. It would go something like queen blocks, queen trades, and then rook captures free bishop. And being up a whole piece can be winning for most opponents. So the king has to get away. And something I immediately notice here for myself is that this line is covered. Wouldn't it be really cool if I had a rook covering this line for an edge of board mate? If you don't know what an edge of board or corridor mate, similar to a back rank mate, only on the side of the board, looks like, check out our Attacking the King series and checkmate patterns. You'll see the edge of the board video. You want to check that out. So I'm immediately thinking, wouldn't it be really cool to bring one of these rooks up and get over here? Well, obviously it's not going to be this rook because that's covered by a knight. So we're looking at this maneuver for checkmate. So that's our threat. So we're going to get rid of some of the defenders. Trying to maneuver off some of the pieces here. And now you see it coming to fruition. This queen has been lured off of this to be able to block. Other defenders like bishop and knight, gone. So what can we do here? Not much. The queen is trying to sacrifice herself to get rid of this rook. Obviously the rook can't move here now because the queen is just going to follow him over. So we take the queen for a rook trade, and then check, check. And with this fork, it's just over. Doesn't matter what this king does. That knight has been taken, and now it's a knight and a queen versus 2 rooks. This is a material advantage that white is going to exploit and definitely win the game. And just as a side note, the pawns are pretty terrible. White's king looks really, really good here. Yeah, those don't look so great. But look at this, isolated, backwards. So resigned here, and white wins. Now, there is one last little thought I want to throw in here. The idea of occupying the square instead of attacking the square. Seems I didn't back that up. This square is empty, and what we're going to do is we're going to use attacking the h7 square as our initial focal point with the idea of occupying g6 instead of attacking g6. And real quick, we'll just see what that looks like. We have a queen sacrifice, okay? And then we have a bishop coming in protected by this knight. And so the king can't exploit it, has to step into the corner. And now we see that the g6 square is a great place to occupy. If you can get a knight into g6, you're probably doing very well. Of course, in this game, it was checkmate. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about the focal point of g6. Maybe that'll help you out next time you see someone using the fianchettoed fortress as a defense. I do encourage you to remember that you are what you repeat. What I mean by that is just watching the video one time isn't enough to really put it into your memory and have you use it over the board. So I encourage you, watch the video again maybe a week from now, take some of these positions, move the pieces over a regular board, practice them with a friend until they start to show up in your next game. Remember to follow us on Facebook at Hood County Chess Club. Until next time, I'm Zach Wilson.